Okay, that's good, I guess. So I've been interested in Max's work for a little while now, because Max is one of a new group of cognitive scientists, pretty new anyway, who are making computational models, actual computational models of how people reason and remember and so on. And what's notable about them is they actually compute things. They, unlike some of the computational models that other people in our field talk about, these models are actually computational. And what makes Max's work especially interesting to me is that he works on the kind of cognition that a lot of people are interested in here, say, which is to say, he's interested in how people manage cooperation. He's interested in how they manage and learn moral rules and moral norms. And for me, especially interesting, things are wandering around here. He is interested in how social learning works, and not on a kind of arm wavy way, but actually as a computational process of how individuals observe others doing things and then make inferences about the representations or the cognitive machinery that's necessary to replicate those behaviors. So he's a Harvard MIT guy. He works with lots of extremely accomplished, famous people. Joe Henrich, Dave Rand, and then the Bayesian cognitive scientists like Tom Griffiths and others. So please welcome Max Kleiman-Weiner.
Thank you. I changed the screen share around. Can everyone still see it okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so thank you so much for that introduction. Today I'm going to be sharing some of the work I think that that Rob really highlighted around the intersection of evolution of cooperation and also models of computational models of cognitive science, and that's been kind of one of my key interests as a computational cognitive scientist. So I'll start off with a brief intro that I think will be quite familiar to most people here. This observation that cooperative behaviors are ubiquitous across the animal kingdom. So here's an example of weaver ants that divide tasks to make nests. Here they're making, making a little bridge, but using their bodies to cross this gap. Or wolf packs that, when they work together, can take down prey much larger than any individual pack members. Or even today, as we're faced with new kinds of machine intelligence, there can be kinds of cooperation between machines or between machines and humans, and all the different ways that these different new kinds of agency could interact with us and with each other. But I think even with that, there are aspects of human cooperation that are distinct. So even a young child can cooperate with a scale, scope, and sophistication that really exceeds all known non-human intelligences. Yes.
Max, sorry to interrupt, but I think a lot of us are not seeing the
We're seeing you and not your screen.
Oh, you're not seeing all my cool things. Okay, hold on.
No screen, sorry.
No screen. Let me try to do the reshare. Okay, hold on.
Sorry, I thought that's what you meant for us to see. I didn't know. I didn't.
No worries.
We started talking about wolves. It had to be, couldn't be him anymore.
All right, tell me now.
Now we're good.
Now we're good. Okay, sorry about that. So anyway, I'll just quickly play the cool animal videos. Here's the weaver ants making a bridge. Here's the wolves hunting some bigger prey, and then here's this. I'll let this one play because this one's the coolest of some two machines cooperating with each other to do something that neither could do on their own, right? So these are all kind of interesting examples of new kinds of cooperation. And then we have these Tomasello experiments that really get into the idea that human cooperation may be distinct in other ways. And I think a big part of this comes down to the way that we can spontaneously solve these novel challenges that are completely distinct. We use all different kinds of strategies, and norms and rules, and things like turn taking. And all of these things are really just a prelude to the unprecedented levels of cooperation that underlie things like social institutions and contracts, such as government, science, technology, morality. And in some cases, these cultural products involve millions of unrelated individuals in different locations, people who will never meet, or maybe will meet once and then never again. And what I really have been interested in is what are the origins of these capacities, the kind of social intelligence that distinguishes humans from other animals, and then how can we design? So that's kind of the cognitive question, but then also the machine learning question. How can we use this knowledge to design machines that are equally capable of acting as our cooperative partners? Right. So, starting off, and again, I think this will be familiar to most, that cooperation is challenging. It's not something that we can get for free, because even though if we're collectively all better off if we cooperate, we might be better off individually only looking out for ourselves. So this is sometimes called the tragedy of the commons. It's what makes cooperation a challenging problem. And there's almost now a half a century of work on this question of how do we reconcile the observation that we see cooperation at all forms of life, and especially in human interaction, with the logic of evolution and economic rationality. And really, again, this has been a central pursuit of almost a half century of research, ranging from evolutionary game theory, anthropology, biology, many different economics, many different fields. And a lot of these studies take as their starting place what I like to think of as almost like a Drosophila, or a key kind of model organism for thinking about cooperation, which is a prisoner's dilemma. And it's really simple in that it hits off two different kinds of possible outcomes. One is a cooperative outcome where both agents choose to cooperate, and that's what's best for the group, or compete or defect, where that's what's best for each individual. And I'm not going to review this logic for this audience, but basically the key idea is that when both players cooperate, that's what's best for the group. When either one competes, they're doing what's best for the individual, regardless of what the other person does. And so this has been, kind of a core challenge problem, and there have been many satisfying answers to this problem. One of the most interesting and exciting ones is this idea of reciprocity, or kind of starting place is an idea called tit for tat. And it starts off with a very basic observation, which is that if you start off by playing cooperate, and then copy the same labeled action that the other player is playing, that can lead to a stable cooperative outcome under certain conditions when this game is repeated over time. But I think when we look at tit for tat, it tells us something about reciprocity, but it actually, from a cognitive perspective, it tells us very little. And in some sense, to the extent that tit for tat actually encodes something about reciprocity, it's much more us as humans reading into tit for tat what it means. So for example, tit for tat doesn't know anything about the payoffs of the game, or that in this game, for example, that cooperate is 7-7. It just knows the label, row 1, and then it says copy the row or column ID of the action that the other player played. So it doesn't actually encode any actual knowledge about reciprocity. It's just an if-then-else rule that happens to work in a certain set of games. Now, of course, evolutionary game theorists and many others have studied a whole rich set of different kinds of games and have developed different kinds of automata strategies that encode this logic. But fundamentally, what we have is ultimately a kind of a zoo of different autonoma, each one specially tuned for a particular kind of game, a particular setting. And what I think from a cognitive perspective feels clear is that the human concept of reciprocity is much more richer. It's more of like an abstract theory that allows us to apply a reciprocal principle to a variety of different contexts, rather than a particular behavioral strategy that only works in a single particular setting. So from the perspective of reverse engineering, what I want to really ask is, how do we as humans learn to and figure out how to cooperate so flexibly and robustly? And in my work, I've kind of looked at this from 3 different perspectives, 2 of which I'll try to get to today. The first is, the evolutionary origins, and how can we think about the evolution of these abstract capacities. The second, which I'm not going to talk about today, are different kinds of developmental learning principles that can be used to learn moral and cultural knowledge over time in an abstract way. And then if I have time, I'll get to some of the work we've done on how these abstract principles in planning can be used in the moment to cooperate in more sophisticated contexts. And maybe if there's not a lot of time, I'll just show that quickly. So what we want are theories that have the elegant and formal computability of a game theoretic representation or a multi-agent reinforcement learning system, but that actually include the kinds of planning and representation that we see as like kind of a hallmark of human learning and thinking. So grounded in planning and representation and learning rather than reflexes. But on the other hand, we don't want to end up with something that's vague, that doesn't have quantitative precision. So something like a theory of joint intentionality or moral grammar. These are very influential and important theories, but they don't have the precision and engineering rigor that would be satisfying to a computer scientist who actually wants to run this on an algorithm. So that's this reverse engineering approach I'm really committed to, is kind of finding the best of both of those approaches. So the first study I'm going to share is worked on with Alejandro Vientos, who's an RA with me, Dave Rand, and my PhD supervisor, Josh Tenenbaum. This was worked on at MIT. And what we do is we start with a kind of a simple observation, which is that unlike an infinitely repeated prisoner's dilemma or any kind of repeated game that is often studied, human interactions are infinitely varied. We never play the same game twice. And so what I'm going to use as kind of a toy example to capture this is, instead of studying a specific game, I'm going to study a kind of a game engine, which produces different decision variables. And so there's a pool of players, there's a distribution of different costs and benefits that can generate numbers to fill in our game. And there's a kind of templated approach here where there's, at each time step, there's an actor who's going to have a choice that they can pay different costs to give benefits to different players. And that can generate all different kinds of games. So on the left, here's an example where the actor A can pay 1 to give 3 to player B, or do nothing. That's that null sign. But a different scenario might be completely costless. They could pay 4 to give, but they have to decide whether they're going to give it to player A or player C. So it's kind of a distribution game. This third example, it's kind of accommodation. You could pay a small cost to help one player or a larger cost to help another player. And by combining these different kinds of games, we can get all different kinds of games, some that have been studied in the literature, like certain kinds of simple bargaining games, others like dictator games or prisoner's dilemma, all kind of can emerge from this, as well as games that have never been studied. And importantly, because the costs and benefits are always varying, the kinds of decisions are always varying in terms of who's involved, we're not going to be able to solve this with the kind of behavioral strategy that have previously been developed. So, if we had a game like this, a repeated prisoner's dilemma, and the solution to a game like this was a behavioral autonoma, like tit for tat would be one example, what would an answer look like to a situation like this, where the game, there's a repeated interaction, but the game itself is never repeated? So that's really what I'm going to try to get at today. And what I'm going to try to argue for is that it's something like an abstract theory of reciprocity that ultimately allows people to be flexible in these contexts. And this is just going to be computational work. And that abstract theory of reciprocity is going to be grounded in 2 key computational ideas. One is a recursive utility function that we developed. So the idea of using utility functions to actually represent values and the welfare of the different agents, obviously taken from behavioral economics, but also a recursive theory of mind, the ability to infer the underlying intentions and hidden desires or values that other agents have, rather than just being subject to the specific behaviors that they do. And that theory of mind is this key piece of cognition and thinking that has been studied in cognitive science in single agent cases, but there are going to be some complexities that we're going to have to tackle in order to bring those ideas into these multi-agent reciprocity context. Also, I meant to say at the beginning, I'd love this to be as much a discussion as you guys would want. So feel free to jump in, ask questions, tell me I'm wrong, and we can battle it out. I think that would be a lot of fun if anyone's willing. So just unmute yourself and say quick question, and we'll switch to discussion mode anytime. Okay, so let's think about how we might develop this. So when we're starting with when we start with repeated prisoner's dilemma land, oftentimes we start with 2 kinds of ideas. There's this kind of selfish idea of an agent that always defects, or altruistic, kind of unconditionally altruistic agent that always cooperates. And we want to map those. What would those mean for our kind of game engine scenario? So instead of them being based on behaviors, we don't have behavioral labels anymore. They're going to be based on the utility function. So we can have a selfish agent, which is meant to capture some of the ideas of like always defect. And this agent, its utility, so the utility that agent I receives is equal to the reward that agent I receives. So this is a pretty straightforward. You just do what's best for yourself. What I'm calling the unconditionally cooperative agent, I'm calling this an altruistic agent. They just want what's best for everybody. So what they do is they take the reward that they would get and then add the reward that the other players get. So that's these other agents, agent J. And you're just basically saying, do what's best for the group, right? But of course, we want to ask, what makes one of these utility functions better than one? What makes one better than the other? What makes a utility function well adapted? And this is, a pretty typical kind of challenge that I think most people here will be familiar. Is it the agent that achieves the best outcome when it's played against its copy? That would be the altruistic agent because it's always doing what's best for the group. What about when it's playing against anybody else? Well, that would be the selfish agent because it's always doing what's best for itself. But we can't make that assumption that we know who these agents are going to be playing with, because in a social world, the environment itself is adaptive. right? Other agents are going to be changing their strategies with response to what's going to be doing. And we can model that kind of adaptiveness as a simple kind of evolutionary process. So for example, if we start with a group of agents where everybody is this altruistic type represented as green, the total welfare of the group is going to be at its highest possible value. But if there's a little bit of let's say that we add a little bit of mutation and noise, and now all of a sudden there's one of these selfish agents into the group, that's going to lower the total group welfare, but that one selfish agent is going to do really well. And if we apply a kind of evolutionary logic where that utility function is replicated, there's going to be more and more of those selfish agents until finally we end up in a situation where all of the agents are selfish and that total welfare of the group is now at its lowest value. Okay, so this is, again, kind of classic evolutionary game theory. Natural selection doesn't forbid cooperation and generosity. It just makes them hard engineering problems. And so really now we have an engineering problem. How do we engineer a utility function that's going to have the right features to enable this kind of reciprocity? And so what we've done is develop what we're calling a reciprocal agent. And this reciprocal agent has a value function that is more complex, has some cognitive complexity that these selfish and altruistic agents don't have. So here's what it looks like, and I'm going to explain the different pieces. So it starts off with that basic R sub I, and that means this reciprocal agent cares about its own, what it gets. It cares about the rewards it gets itself. But really the meat of what's going on here is happening in the second part of the equation. And so I'm going to break this down into two parts. So there's a sum over all the other agents, right? That's the summation sign. And then there's that R sub J, and R sub J is the reward received by the other agents. Now, unlike the altruistic agent, it doesn't just take that reward and integrate it no matter what. Instead, it weights how much it cares about the rewards that J receives, depending on its beliefs about agent J. And that's that second part. PI is a probability, it's a probability distribution over agent I's beliefs about agent J. And in particular here, what it's saying is it cares about how likely the type of agent J is equal to the type of agent I. Now, the types here are defined in terms of utility functions. So what it's saying is, I'll value the reward that agent J receives to the extent that I believe that agent J is also doing this same kind of reciprocal utility function that I am. And if it's not, I'm not going to value the reward that they receive at all, right? And so you can kind of see that there's that conditional logic built into this utility function. Okay, so now the challenge, right, of course, is that unlike a behavior, I never observe the utility function of anybody else in the real world. I might know my own, but the underlying way that the utility functions of other people in the world is a hidden feature, right? It's their type. It's not something that is observed. And the challenge here is then how can we learn that? And so here's what we do. We're going to take a kind of what has been a well-studied model of Bayesian theory of mind that inverts a theory of rational action to be able to make these inferences flexibly from data. And I'm just this is the sketch of how this works in a kind of a single player setting. So the idea is that all the actions that I take as an agent, I'm going to assume that agents take actions with respect to their utility functions represented by our thinker. It's going to be the placeholder for the different utility functions agents might have. And we can model that as a kind of noisy utility maximization. So it's this like Boltzmann rational, or you can think about it as a generalization of loose choice, that the higher your utility of an action, the higher the probability that you're going to take that action, but with some noise involved. And we can change those noise values. And so if I make the assumption that agents are choosing actions with proportional to the value of those actions, then I can model theory of mind, this inverse, which is what's the probability of the utility function given the action. Now this is the posterior. And what I want is, so the posterior is going to depend on this is just the standard Bayesian math, right, of the likelihood and the prior. The prior is just my prior over how likely do I think your type is, or how likely do I think a certain utility function is a priori before I see any data. And the likelihood is just, again, it's just that model of action that we see at the top part of the slide, right? It's how likely is an agent to pick that action given given the utility function. Okay, so let's see how this might play out, right? So, you have agent A, and here's their prior, right? So they have a prior that's slightly weighted on themselves. They think, reciprocal agents might be slightly more likely, but there's some probability you could be altruistic or selfish. And now let's imagine a game where we just to make it easy to talk about, nice means I pay 1 to give you 3, and means I do nothing, right? So a symmetric version of this game would be a prisoner's dilemma, but let's just consider it in this kind of single action case. So the first thing we observe, and so this is our prior about agent A, right? Okay, so now we observe agent A be nice to agent B. So they pay 1 to give 3. And let's look at the impact of that on the beliefs that we have about A. So the math works, right? So now after seeing A be nice, we say, okay, well, I still have some uncertainty, but A is either reciprocal or they're altruistic, but a selfish agent would be very, very unlikely to do that. And so that kind of Bayesian updating is doing the right thing. Now, if we see the other thing, if we see agent A be mean to B, again, it does the right thing, right? There's maybe some probability of reciprocal because there's that noise, some of that noise in how you weight the values of the other agent, but it's most likely this agent is a selfish agent, right? Okay, so everything is looking good. If we just applying that kind of standard Bayesian theory of mind. But I'm going to show how a naive application of this kind of Bayesian inference without any way of without extending it to the social interactive case that will fail, right? So, okay, so we're starting with that point where A was mean to B. And again, we have the right update. A looks like A is selfish. And now we see in a second time step, B is mean to A. So B is kind of, I think intuitively would think maybe, what do we think? Let's look at first what the model predicts. So the model predicts, well, B was mean, and mean is something that's done by selfish agents. But I think for most of us, I think that's not the intuition that we would have, right? We would say, well, B isn't a selfish agent here. B is just reciprocating the selfishness to A. So it's possible that B is selfish. There's uncertainty here, but it's more likely, it's less likely that B is selfish than A is selfish, because B is being mean in response to someone being mean to them, while A was kind of was selfish without any reason to be mean. Okay, so what we're going to need to do is to be able to capture that kind of reasoning where we're actually not just modeling what we think about A and B, but also what A and B think about each other, right? And so that's this idea of a recursive theory of mind, that we actually have to model these agents that are acting as having minds and beliefs and doing this updating process themselves. And so we can kind of nest that recursively many different times. And to abstract that out a little bit, we can look at it as this like kind of growing tree of beliefs as we get deeper and deeper. Now, the problem is, oops, sorry, hold on, someone's trying to call me. Let me put on like a do not disturb. Okay. Can everyone still see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Right, so you can think of this growing tree of beliefs, but of course this isn't going to scale, right? Because you can kind of model this tree out into infinity, and when we've used this model in our simulations, it's ultimately an approximation and things basically blow up. And so what we've done is taken ideas from computer science that look at different ways of thinking about joint belief and common knowledge. And we've developed a new way of tracking recursive beliefs that allow for efficient tracking. And the kind of intuitive idea is that instead of tracking what I know, you know, or what I think, you think, he thinks, she thinks, we instead model what do we know? What do we know about each other, and what do different groups know about their kind of shared belief state? And the key intuition here is that if a behavior was observed by A and not B, then it can't be part of A's model of B's beliefs because B didn't believe it. But it can't be a model of B's beliefs about A because it would be irrational and then A just wouldn't be aware of it, right? So what's going on here is that A's model of B's beliefs only depends on the beliefs that are the events or behaviors that are jointly observed by A and B, right? So for each partition of agents, so this grows too, but we have ways of approximating it. Each partition of agents, we can just think about what are that collection of agents, what data have they collectively seen? So therefore, so A's model of B's beliefs should be identical to the beliefs of an external agent, kind of in a view from nowhere, that is observing the same data that was jointly observed by B and A together. So A's beliefs about B should be equal to B's beliefs about A, given that they've seen the same data, right? And then we can expand that. So A's beliefs about C's beliefs about B's beliefs should be the things that they both believe. Was there a question? You're muted. Rob, you're still muted.
Oh, I see. At a certain age, anyway, so doesn't this depend on everybody having the same prescriptions about how A should respond to B and B should respond to A? given the payoff structures and beliefs. I mean, we know there's lots of cultural variation in what's expected. I mean, in experiments and I think ethnographically. So am I missing something or?
Yeah. So let me clarify. None of this is about how to respond, right? This is just about how to do that type inference, right? So, we can argue about whether that reciprocal model is the right way of encoding reciprocity, and I think there's some interesting features of it that may exist in some cultures or could clearly vary in different ways. But what's happening here is really is really fundamentally just how do I learn the types of agents given their behaviors? And that type space is something that is going to be far richer than anything we've studied here. But I think the type space is where you would build in the kind of the diversity. But what's going on here is just how to do that inference process of learning the types of others from their behavior.
So the person who's taking the view from nowhere has the same types in mind, or maybe they're in the world, as the people in the population. Is that what you're saying?
Okay, good. So that's right. Essentially, one key assumption here is that we're starting with agents having a certain type space, right? So if you introduce someone outside of this type space, they'll still do something, but they might not learn the ground truth type because it won't be in their prior, right? So this is one of the challenges of taking a Bayesian approach, is that you essentially have to say, well, what is the prior space? And in other work, not my own, people have looked at how you can learn the prior itself, but that ends up being an extra hard problem on top of this.
Yeah,
we're assuming that the prior space is known and that agents have the same prior.
But I'll ask one more question and then I'll shut up. These types incorporate information about how individuals respond to the data they're given about other people's interactions and their own interactions and so on. So they have shoulds in them, so to speak, yeah?
Yeah, oh, I see. I think they're not, maybe it should, yeah, I would say that they definitely have expectations about what types will do. That's right. Okay. Yeah, that's right.
Mute myself again in listening to the sirens here.
No, that was great. So, but I think, yeah, maybe just to kind of reemphasize that, a key assumption here is that agents have expectations about what types will do, and that those are actually shared in the population. And if you break that assumption, things are going to get messier, but they don't totally collapse. And you can add quite a bit of noise into what's going on and have this still be robust. Although, of course, if you take it totally out of distribution, it's going to collapse. And I think that's probably realistic too. If you have no idea how to model someone, it's very hard to figure out how to cooperate with them. Okay, so. But I think the key point to emphasize about this particular representation of knowledge is that it simplifies the ability to reason about groups and how to update that knowledge in response to behavior when it's agents reasoning about each other rather than just an observer reasoning about a single agent. That would be typical in a theory of mind setting. Okay, so let's take this recursive theory of mind and put it back into our example. So we had this kind of failure mode here where agent A being mean to B and B being mean back, was A and B were seen as equal. But if we bring our recursive theory of mind to bear, it kind of fixes this, right? So now B is seen as still being possibly selfish, but now being much more likely to be of the reciprocal type, while A is seen as likely to be selfish. If we see B be mean back to, be nice back to A, well, before we fixed the recursive theory of mind, it was, well, it could be reciprocal, but it could be altruistic. And now when we add that recursive theory of mind, we get that B is more likely to be altruistic because they're unconditionally being nice to someone who is just mean to them. They're not reciprocating, meanness and niceness. Okay. So I've now shown an example of how this works at a very miniature level, like the interaction between a few agents. But we can now look at how it works over the course of a generation, over a series of small interactions. So what I'm showing here are the average beliefs of the learning agents when they are paired privately in a private interaction with these different types. So when it's paired with the selfish agent, is what I'm showing you right now. And what we want to see is that red curve go up because that means it's learning correctly that the agent that it's playing is the selfish agent. So this is, a bunch of agents playing a repeated prisoner's dilemma with themselves and updating their beliefs about what agents they're playing with. So when they're paired with selfish agents, they quickly, just after even a few interactions, learn they're playing with the selfish agent. and then when they're playing with altruistic and reciprocal agents, they also learn quite quickly as well. Not as quickly as that they learn that the agents are selfish. So some interesting learning dynamics happening at kind of an intra-generational level. But I think, you can imagine why it would be hard to figure out who's cooperative, who's altruistic versus who's reciprocal if you yourself are reciprocal, because you're both kind of entering into a relatively cooperative engagement. Okay, so now let's look at the kind of intergenerational dynamics, these evolutionary dynamics. How well does this work? So, here's our game engine environment. And the way we're going to model an evolutionary dynamic is a Moran process where at each generation, a single player changes their type proportional to kind of the soft max of the payoff, right? Of the fitness of that type. And so this is, and we're going to in particular study this as with a small mutation rate with weak selection in the kind of limit of small mutation and weak selection in a finite population. Okay, so this allows us to do some simplify the simulations quite a bit. Okay, so the first thing I'm showing you is basically on the x-axis, what we're seeing is the expected number. So this is like the probability of repetition on the bottom. And instead of plotting the probability, I'm plotting the expected number of interactions that will occur. So what we're seeing here is basically, exactly what we'd expect to see if reciprocity is working. When the expected number of interactions are, then let me explain the graph, sorry. And then you can think about this as like columns. So the color represents the kind of steady state proportion of different types. So when you see a kind of big red column, that means the selfish agent is the dominant type. When you see a big blue column, that means the reciprocal agent is the dominant type. And so what you can see here is that for very low repetition, probabilities, the selfish agent is the dominant player, and that makes sense because you have little incentive to reciprocate when there's not a long enough interaction. But even with just a few, with a slightly longer interaction time horizon, you can get this reciprocal agent kind of taking over and being the dominant agent in the population, right? So at a certain threshold, the reciprocal agent becomes kind of the rational choice to play here. Now, one kind of nice thing about this system is that, and kind of going back almost 20 plus years into this literature is, or actually more than that, is robustness to noise. So what happens if if instead of agents being able to directly pick their action, they have an intention, but then with some probability epsilon, that intention is corrupted and you change what the choice would be to randomly to a different choice. So if I tried to pick the nice thing, there's some probability epsilon that it'll move to the selfish thing. If I try to pick the selfish one, it's some probability that it'll move to the cooperative one. So it's just kind of a trembling hand. And what we can see here is that once the noise level gets really big, everything becomes equal because there's no agency in the world anymore. But even for these low probabilities of noise, where we've seen other kinds of models of agency have problems, these agents are actually quite robust to noise, right? So even up to looking at the graphs, like 1 out of 10 actions, 10% noise, or even you're actually still getting pretty robust reciprocal cooperation under these graphs. So because of the way, and I think what I want to highlight here is because of the way that we're doing learning, it's a probabilistic approach to learning rather than a behavioral matching approach to behavior. And by being probabilistic, we're able to handle noise in the right way, right? So that's essentially the key intuition. Okay, so I've showed you how this model works in this kind of new environment, this game engine where you're never playing the same behavior twice. But I think it's important and illustrative to look, how do these agents actually compare to these other models, not ones that I made up, in like a more canonical environment, like the repeated prisoner's dilemma. So, let's take all of our favorite agents from repeated prisoner's dilemma land: always defect, always cooperate, tit for tat, which I described earlier. Generous tit for tat, which starts off cooperating. These are these noise robust strategies that start off cooperating, but they sometimes go back. And they're like tit for tat, but they sometimes go back to cooperating with some probability to try to be more stable. And then also win, stay, lose, shift, sometimes called Pavlov, which treats certain outcomes as wins and others as lost, and has this nice kind of error correcting code feature for noise. And so what we wanted to look at is, how well does our agents compare without any extra tuning? We just put them back into these repeated prisoner's dilemma context against these agents that have been specially designed to succeed in those environments. And so just to make sure everything's working, we show that we can replicate the, the kind of the standard outcomes that we would see. So these are just with these with the other agents, not our agent. These are the steady state distributions as a function of repetition. And of course, when you don't have a lot of repeated interactions, you get mostly all defect. As you get a certain, a higher probability of repetition, tit for tat and win, stay, lose, shift become good strategies. When you add noise, again, you get the fact you go from a situation where tit for tat was maybe a little bit better to win, stay, lose, shift being significantly better under noise because it has some of that error correcting code. So you can see that the orange becomes really big. But even once you get to that 10, 20% noise, win, stay, lose, shift doesn't do so well anymore, right? Because it's overwhelmed by the noise in the environment. Okay, so now what I'm going to show you is what happens when we add our agent into the tournament. And what we see is that, again, for that early stage of probability of repetition, always defect is still dominant, right? Because you just don't have the gains of cooperation. There isn't any value to being reciprocal or cooperative. But our agent actually outcompetes these other agents beyond that threshold for the most part. And then second of all, when we add noise, again, this is the same noise axis as on the left, our agent's really robust to noise in this context and is able to maintain a cooperative equilibrium against always defect, even in the presence of a lot of noise. So it's significantly more robust than win, stay, lose, shift in this context. We also looked a little bit to see, I think I showed you kind of the computational complexity that goes into this. It would be, one I think could rightly argue that it's unfair to just do an apples to apples comparison here when without accounting for some of those cognitive costs. And so, these are relative costs relative to the benefits and costs of the environment. But we can penalize the we can say, for every action, our reciprocal agent is going to pay an extra 10% of the benefit in cognitive costs, and it still is good. It still can outcompete these other agents. So it's not just a kind of razor thin margin, but there's actually is some leeway for cost there. Of course, as the cost gets bigger, the other traditional behavioral automata can do better. Okay.
Could I ask one more question?
Yeah, of course.
So in the behavioral automata versions, there's always this problem of indirect invasion. So all C has the same fitness payoff as tit for tat does, and so on. But we're not seeing any of that in these graphs.
Yeah.
All C is a total failure. And yet, when you're, not so much in these, but the previous ones, you had, even at equilibrium, well, steady state, yeah, you have a few all C's guys down here on the left-hand one, even at the end. Why don't they drift in? This is a finite population with mutation. They should have the same payoff as your reciprocators. Do the reciprocators penalize them for being too nice?
Yeah, great question. So the answer is yes. If the reciprocators can figure out that they're altruistic, that altruistic type, they will stop cooperating with them. So this is a kind of a very parochial kind of reciprocity, right? Which says, I don't care if you'd cooperate with me. What I care is that you're the same type as me, right? And just an unconditional cooperator is not the same type as a reciprocal type. And so if it can, now again, going back to these learning curves, right? It's gonna figure that out. It figures out the altruistic type much slower than it figures out the selfish type, and it even figures out the self type. And again, these depend on a lot of the parameters in the environment, the noise, the game engine versus the repeated prisoner's dilemma. But that's exactly what you see going on here. Is that it is able to figure out who the reciprocal types are and cooperate less with them. And
the altruistic types, you mean.
And yeah, exactly. Sorry, exactly. All C types, and likewise, it's actually able to do that not just for the all C type, but also for some of the other automata that would be reciprocal.
So this is really a secret handshake.
Yeah. Exactly. So, yeah, I think it's a kind of secret handshake, but it's I think that's definitely a reasonable way of thinking about it. I don't think we'd have a great name for this agent yet. One idea that I think it was Dave's idea was calling it like the Bayesian handshake or something like that.
Yeah, but it's going to get a lot harder when there's 100 types and not 3 types, right?
Yeah, well, so it would be harder from the perspective of computation. But remember, I think from a behavioral perspective, it's good to estimate the types, but behaviorally, all you care is me versus other, right?
Yeah,
so actually,
one type's going to win, but predicting which type and linking it to the social consequences may get quite a bit harder. Yeah.
Yeah. So I see. Okay. So exactly. I think especially in these simple games, right? If you had 100 types, most of them are probably going to do the same thing in each context, right? So it's just completely overdetermined. So you're not going to be able to as quickly distinguish them. So I can imagine some of these, some of the kind of the solutions to that indirect drift breaking down, right? Like you would be less robust to certain kinds of things. But I think fundamentally, you would still be able to say, is this what really, because from a behavioral perspective, what this agent's really asking is, would I do that? And then it almost doesn't matter what else would do that. If you wouldn't do it, that's sufficient to know that you don't want to be cooperative with that agent.
I'd love to keep on this, but
Yeah.
I'm going to shut up.
Okay, no, but I think this is great. And I mean, just also point to future work. We've also experimented a little bit with less parochial versions of this kind of this algorithm, right? So you could, instead of just saying I'll only cooperate with my type, we had a variant we called the nice reciprocal agent, which cooperated with also with the altruistic agent. And you can imagine saying, well, I'm going to cooperate with agents that I know would value me in the right way, or other things like that, or ways of learning which ones are good to cooperate with and which are not, that go beyond just that kind of very narrow parochial, I only want to work with myself.
Yeah, I have a related question. So
yeah.
It's almost the same question, but a little bit further. So would the reciprocal agent cooperate with tit-for-tat agent, or will he recognize that the tit-for-tat agent is different? So he will not cooperate with the tit-for-tat agent.
Yeah,
I mean, because it's almost like a kin recognition mechanism. Well, I recognize my kin, so it's almost like a kin selection in favor of the reciprocal agent, right? If they only cooperate with themselves, right?
Yeah. So I don't have it in the presentation, but I've made these same kind of graphs for the automata land, and basically, what you would see is that it can learn who tit for tat. It can distinguish tit for tat from itself, but it's really hard. And it can take now there are features that help it learn who's who, right? So for example, when the noise rate is in the right level, right, it gets better data about, oh, you're not doing a kind of a smart integration of belief to figure out whether or not you should switch from cooperate to defect. You're actually just doing kind of this on-off switch, and that can be very informative that the agent's tit for tat. But when you look at it in some of the scenarios that I showed, it actually takes a very long time to figure out who tit for tat is. So it's not magic, right? It can't figure out who certain agents are harder to learn about than others, depending on how closely they are in terms of mimicking at a behavioral level what the reciprocal agent would do in that context. So that's, I think, the first part of your question is it can learn it, but it's hard, and it depends fundamentally on the kinds of data that agent produces. And two, then the second point of your question was like, there's kind of a kin selection-like mechanism happening here. And I think that's a reasonable way of thinking about it. In some way, it's like, yeah, if you think of like the genotype is the utility function, then you're saying everyone who has the same utility function as me is someone who I want to cooperate with, and I'm just learning who my kin are. I think the difference here from a kind of a vanilla kin selection style mechanism is the causality, right? Is that the kin mechanism here, or the kind of the latent representation of the utility function is actually causal for behavior. While in a typical kin selection paradigm, my kin is much more about your lineage and where you came from, rather than the causal mechanisms of your behavior. So, but that said, I wouldn't be surprised if the same math ends up applying. So, I'm not an expert in kin selection, and I know there's some people on the like everything is kin selection, and I don't want to jump into that, and I don't have the knowledge to jump into that. But I do think there's some deep parallels to kin selection in the mechanism that I'm proposing. It's not simply a behavioral kind of a form of reciprocity. And I think I'll emphasize that in this next section if there aren't any other questions, but happy to take more questions. Okay, cool. So I showed you all the examples I've showed you have been what I've been calling private interactions. So this is the typical prisoner's dilemma, repeated prisoner's dilemma scenario. So if you and I are playing, no one else watches. It's just me and you playing a dyadic interaction. But of course, we know the importance of third-party interaction, observation, observational learning, monitoring, signaling, and all of these things that come into play when you're when faced with not just having to respond to the behavior of someone else when it's applied to you or to oneself, but rather to actually integrating information from a population. And so I'm calling this kind of where the interactions are public. And so we can look at these same learning curves. And so now instead of its number of interactions, it's the number of observations. It's just how many times have I seen anybody interact? All the observations are public. And what we can see is two things. One is the same learning mechanism without any modification is able to successfully figure out who's who just from that observational data. It's able to do it quite rapidly. One interesting thing to note here, just comparing the two graphs, is that it's able to learn the altruistic agent much better, who the altruistic agent is much better than in the public setting versus the private setting. And that makes sense, right? Because if I see what the altruistic agent is going to do is it's going to just keep cooperating with a selfish agent, right? So you'll see that and be like, oh, only an altruistic agent would do that, and upweight the probability that that agent is altruistic. So again, when we change the kind of data, we get different kinds of inferences, but because we're being Bayesian about the reasoning, it's able to integrate that with the agent's own experiences together. Okay, so now we can study this again in the same kind of context, but we're going to vary the probability that an interaction is public. So when this parameter, when the parameter omega is 0, it's the private setting. When it's 1, everything is public. And when we vary in between 0 and 1, it's the probability that each interaction is observed by everybody. Okay, so calling this kind of an indirect reciprocity setting. And what you can see here is that for small 0, for low W, and I should also add, we're importantly studying this in the context where each agent only interacts with another agent once. So there's no possibility of direct reciprocity in this setting because you never have a chance to reciprocate to somebody else with somebody else. So when everything's private, we're back to this case of the private prisoners. Repeated prisoner's dilemma, cooperation doesn't work out and the selfish agent is dominant. When everything is observed, even when agents only interact with each other once, you can get a relatively robust level of cooperation. And then for these kind of middle values, you can see that there's still a good amount of cooperation that's available, even when not every single observation is public. Okay, so these are the key results I wanted to show for this project. And I think this is something we kind of got for free in a way, right? The ability to integrate direct and indirect kinds of reciprocity by using the right kinds of abstract learning mechanisms. So just to kind of sum up this section of the talk, I think kind of introduced two ideas here, right? This new utility function and just the idea of using utility functions in these evolutionary contexts for thinking about how agents might be able to play a multitude of different games without having to define behavioral strategies. And then second, the kinds of multi-agent learning strategies that would be needed, a recursive theory of mind, that are needed to actually make cooperation work in these contexts. And one kind of just generalization is, I think sometimes when we came into this with the goal to solve a harder problem, to solve these game engine contexts. And sometimes when you set out to solve a harder problem, you develop a harder solution. You end up with a more complicated solution just because you're trying to solve a harder problem. But I think what we showed by bringing these results back into the world of the repeated prisoner's dilemma, that by adding some of that complexity, we actually got something that wasn't just more complex, but also a kind of cooperation that was ultimately more powerful, and that brings in some of those ideas about the how people actually do social learning and the computational mechanisms to underlie that kind of learning. So it's 11:52. I don't know if I should sort of stop here and we can just have a discussion, or I can briefly go over a few other things just to kind of give you a sense of what what I'll talk about it when you invite me back next time, or but it's totally up to you. If we want to stop at the hour, maybe I'll just do like 3 more minutes, or maybe give me a little bit of guidance.
Why don't you sum up tell us a little bit about other things you want to mention and then
Okay.
discuss.
Perfect. Okay, so I'll just keep this really brief. So the real second part of the talk, and I'll just go through this quickly, is to look at, really much more, instead of getting rid of the evolutionary component, but looking at the challenges in the moment, right? So cooperation isn't just choosing an action, it's choosing a whole plan, it's choosing a sequence of actions. And we've started to study cooperation in these much more rich games. I've called those naturalistic games. And instead of picking an action, agents actually control a little avatar and move around. So in this game, you move up, down, left, right. The agents are the circles, the goals are the colored squares. They tell you how many points you get. Agents move simultaneously. And hold on. And so you choose where you want to move. If two agents move into the same square, one will enter and one will get knocked out. And then agents can move around and get into the goal. They pay a cost for moving. They earn points for getting to the goal. And so you can think about what would it mean to cooperate in a game like this. We won't do the Q&A demo. It might be something like this, where they both move kind of to the outer edges and receive 7 points, 3 moves, 10 points each. But competition might look something like this, where one agent goes into the goal while the other one's cooperating, right? So cooperation, we can think about what cooperation and competition mean here. But again, it's not really cooperate or compete. It's really reasoning over a complex set of actions and figuring out what is competition, what is cooperation, and then figuring out how to understand what the other person is doing in terms of cooperation and competition. And so it's really this much more sophisticated game. And what we've done is, let me skip ahead, is to use the kind of rules of the game and to look at generalization across games. So again, behavioral strategies won't work. We've looked at human behavior and studied how people actually play these games, and developed models of developed computational models that based on reinforcement learning that operate within these two kinds of planning modes that allow us to extract cooperative and competitive modes of planning to play these games. And then again, that same idea of Bayesian theory of mind, of figuring out, given your actions, what was your intention, and reciprocating based on that. And we show in a variety of different experiments that our model can capture both how people play, it's predictive of how people play, but that it does better at capturing these. I'll show this. The blue bar is the model likelihood. It does better at capturing the kinds of reciprocal mechanisms that people are using better than a win, stay, lose shift, or something that's just dependent on outcomes, but rather focused on learning using that Bayesian learning module. So just another example. And then mouse is, I guess I'll show this. So this is just to point to some future work that is, one thing we observed in the data that we didn't have a model for was something like this, where the two agents interact. They've been competing for many rounds. And then blue moves into yellow's goal. And then we saw something like this happen. And after this, they started cooperating. So I don't know if I kind of skipped this whole part of the talk. I don't know if this is interesting to you, but it almost seems like even in this simple kind of spatial setting, yellow's blue is maybe teaching yellow or trying to show yellow how to cooperate or that they want to cooperate with them. And so in other work, I looked at how agents might share or hide intentions, making their intention obvious or making it hiding it from the other agent, hiding their intentions in a competitive scenario. We've looked at generalizations to more than 2 players and 3-player contexts, where it's not just cooperate or compete, but you might cooperate to compete, where you're actually working with one agent to compete against another, and different kinds of grammars of expressing those relationships where you're nesting cooperation and competition. Some behavioral studies. And then in some very recent work, we've looked at purely cooperative planning, but again, where it requires agents to combine their sub-plans to figure out who should do what. Do we divide and conquer, or do we work together on the same task? We took inspiration from a video game called Overcooked and developed a bunch of different cooking scenarios and had different agents and people look at and interact in these games. And then finally, we scaled up some of these models and built an AI agent that can play the game of Avalon, the Resistance Avalon, which is a game of figuring out friend and foe. You don't know, the bad guys know who the bad guys are, the good guys don't know who anybody is but themselves. And through their behaviors, they kind of have to learn it and figure out who's who. We built a model that is both predictive of how people do belief updating in these games, but is also a superhuman cooperator when paired randomly with people. And I think that's probably a good place to end. Basically, this is kind of a general program looking at at the different scale, scope, and sophistication of human cooperation, and how it ultimately is underpinned by these powerful learning mechanisms, and how we can use computational models and ideas from Bayesian inference and social cognition to really build formal models of these systems. So thank you, and happy to discuss and stay for a bit.
Great. So I'll let people just speak up if they'd like to ask questions. And also I will keep track of the chat if people are shy. I just read a paper that says that women don't ask questions in seminars. So speak up, folks. Well, I have a question. So one of the enduring puzzles is why we seem to have so much more reciprocity in humans than in other animals. And so your model seems to be something that ought to be within reach for other vaguely intelligent social creatures. They have chances to see what others do. They can remember that. They know everybody as individuals. And so what do you think the special cognitive sauce is that would power this, and how, what are the constraints, do you think?
Yeah, so that's great. I think I don't have any data to speak to this, although I'm working with Joseph Call and others actually looking at some of these kinds of models in the context of bonobo and chimpanzee behavior, but that's very, very, very future work. I think one way of looking at these models, and I think I'm kind of in the, I don't know if it's a school, but I'm thinking carefully from sort of Tomasello's work on joint intentions. And I think in both of these, in the work I've done, at key points, there's this shift from just remembering who's who and doing I think you think, that kind of recursive thinking, to having to be able to do that kind of joint thinking. What do we know about each other? What should we do in this context? Who should do what? So in the place I spent most of my time on the evolution of cooperation, it's really that joint belief structure, right? That ability to think about not just what I think you think, but also, you know, what do we think? In the second study, I kind of glazed over very briefly at the end. There's a key part of the planning that is about joint intentions rather than just best response. And so, and then combining those two kind of computational features from my work with the empirical work from Michael Tomasello and his students and many others on that kind of we thinking as being key to what makes humans distinct, I think that may, you know, I like to think that that's a potentially satisfying answer to that question, that it really comes down to, you know, the tippy top of the sophistication of the social representations. That it's not enough to just remember who's who and remember their behavior, but to and maybe even to do that kind of belief reasoning of I think you think, but actually to even go a step further and really ground these things to like what do we think, and to think about yourself as a group with someone else or in a joint intention with somebody else. But I would love to, you know, even just know what you think about, if you think that's a reasonable place to go, or if you know.
Yeah, it depends on what you need to know about others in order to run this kind of system. I mean, I think baboons have a really good, they have reasonably good knowledge about what others have done in the past. And they are, I mean, baboons anyway, do, I think, have a sense that it's important to make their own intentions clear to others in order to facilitate social interactions. But the evidence suggests that they don't have a really good theory of what's going on in others' minds. So it's hard to know. I mean, you know, what.
So even that basic theory of mind level reasoning may be only weakly available to them.
Well, the question is, what do they need to know? I mean, they know I've tried to groom, you know, I've groomed this animal 20 times in the past and she's never groomed me back. I mean, they know that.
Yeah.
That. Do they know that that's because, do they have any representation of what's going on in her mind? I don't know. And the thing is, they don't need to know that. So the question is, what do they need to know in order to, so that's the other thing. What do they need to know in order to have the kinds of basically highly reciprocal grooming relationships, say, that they do have? So that's interesting. It's interesting to think about. They need, what do they need in order to have these kinds of reciprocal grooming relationships? And then what more would they need to know to have to reciprocate more and in more context, and when the stakes are higher? I don't know.
Yeah.
If I could follow up on that, so I'm going to, I never like arguments like Mike's, because, cooperation is an immensely powerful adaptive tool, and lineages that have solved the problem of how to punish free riders have been fantastic evolutionary successes. So termites, ants, somebody calculated that half the animal biomass in the tropics is termites, etc., right? And so the fact that chimpanzees don't, or baboons don't have theory of mind right now, that's not sufficient, right? On your model, it should be easy, unless there's some, adaptive valley or something it's hard to get across. If you can get there step by step, there ought to be tons of selection for better and better and better ability to reason about each other and to organize ourselves into cooperative arrangements. Humans are a fantastic success because, I think, in part because we're so cooperative. Kim's here and he can, wax eloquent about the power that food sharing and other kinds of mutual aid give hunter-gatherer populations. So I think this is a big problem for models that show that cooperation is easy to evolve unless we have some plausible theory about why. Just a little bit of gray matter, right? Animals that need specializations, those acorn woodpeckers can remember the location of 20,000 acorns they've cached. Selection can change these things, right? In response to particular environments. So I think this is a big challenge, actually, to theories that predict that we should see reciprocity all over the place.
Yeah, I definitely think, I hope I didn't come across as being, I'm in the camp of like, we probably won't see reciprocity all over the place, because, I think like, ants and other kind of, there are plenty of places where you can see reciprocity or other, highly cooperative animals, but they're very behavioral, right? It's like they figured out how to build in the right behavioral if-then switches. And I think what at least seems to be much more challenging is that abstract notion of reciprocity, to know that, to be able to understand a new context and ground it into something as abstract as cooperation. I think, that this is it builds on a whole suite of abilities that may not have been particularly developed for cooperation. Like theory of mind being potentially one of them. Yeah. Although no argument as to which way it went, right? Whether, yeah.
So I had a question. So I was interested in your statement that the way you formulated your reciprocal agent makes it more robust to errors. So, so can you talk and help me think a little bit about whether that robustness would be the same if the types of errors are implementation type errors versus perception errors? Because in behavioral strategies, there would be a huge difference. So I couldn't think, and I'm wondering whether you can,
yeah,
off the top of your head.
Yeah. So okay, that's a okay. So these were implementation errors. Perception errors here would actually be more challenging. for this model as implemented, because a perceptual error would break some of the assumptions about who's observed what, right? We could no longer make the assumption that if you and I have interacted, we observed the same thing happen, right? And so that would change. We'd have to then rethink how we're doing the belief accounting to model that. So maybe you'd have to fall back on that I think, you think, I think recursion, which would handle that, and you'd have divergences. I haven't tested whether that's robust to the kinds of perception errors you're talking about, but maybe just to say a little bit more then about how it works in the implementation errors case. One way you can think about it is that you can think of the belief as a quantitative representation of reputation, right? It's like, so the closer I am to being 100% confident that you're a reciprocal type, the more kind of reputation you have to burn, right? So if you have a really high, if I've seen you cooperate 100 times with me, right, and then it's a defection, it's much more likely for me to attribute that to noise under Bayesian inference than if I've never interacted with you before and you defect on me. That it just kind of falls out of the math when you include these probabilities in terms of likelihood. So it allows for sometimes like accumulation of reputation is an overloaded term here, so it's probably the wrong one, but it's like first, it's a certain kind of like computational emergence of a first impressions matter. So that ends up being quite important. I think for perception, if we were to add perception errors without changing anything, we could still run it and see what happens. I would guess that we would still see the same kind of effect, but we'd run into this interesting problem where the models the agents have about each other start to diverge, and then that can lead to some weirdnesses we have found computationally. So, but I don't know what those instabilities would lead to. That's a good question.
Could I follow up on that question? I'm Gleason, I'm a graduate student. I had the question that Sarah asked about the perception errors and whatnot, and I saw that you also had like indirect reciprocity. And if somebody has witnessed something like 100 times, right? But we're getting to indirect reciprocity where it's going to be one-time interactions with people. I guess what is the mechanism, and how are I guess how do the errors work with that, if you don't mind me asking? Yeah, well, so in the context that I was showing, which I was, it's not indirect reciprocity is the emergent phenomena, but the context of like you never interact with the same person twice, where we would look for that kind of those kinds of behaviors. The idea would be, well, you're not seeing. I'm only personally interacting with you once or twice, but I may be observing you interact in a variety of different situations. Could be 10 times, right? So I can see how you interact with others, and more importantly, I can also see how others interact with you, right? So if I can see how you responded to you can kind of, at the very beginning it's challenging, but once you get a few interactions in place, it starts to you can kind of solve the puzzle, right? It's like if A is mean to B and then later C is mean to A, but C was nice to a bunch of other people, then you're like, oh, well, C's probably doing that kind of reciprocal reasoning. They're probably my type. While if C is just mean to everybody, they're selfish. If A is nice to everybody, they're altruistic. And so you can start to do that kind of backward reasoning, but not in a backward reasoning type way. You're just doing it by kind of constantly updating your beliefs about what people do. Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you. And I apologize. This may be a naive question, but I guess how also does shifting strategies work, right? If you're selfish and then people still don't cooperate with you, and then all of a sudden in the future you start to cooperate, how does that impact the model? And errors about, is this like a one-time cooperation and then you're going to go back to defecting or something? No, that's a great question. So this is something I've been actually very interested in. What if you change strategies during your lifetime? And essentially, from the way that the math of the evolutionary dynamic works is that there's no distinct, like nothing changes within a generation, right? So agents do stuff, they might learn about each other, but then everyone's reset in a new generation. But of course, that's kind of not a great model of thinking about
these as real relationships over time where people can actually kind of culturally evolve in their lifetime or change their values. And I think there's lots of really interesting phenomena that could capture. One nice thing about this is that actually we can actually build that in. We can actually allow agents to change. So there's two things. One is, if we allow agents to change their type in the environment, what will our agent do? Our agent's not going to model that at all, because we haven't given it any capacity to reason about that. But one nice thing about being Bayesian here is we can just add a level of hierarchy. And so all you'd have is you would have an additional level of uncertainty, which is this agent the same? So essentially what we're assuming is each agent has a type. When we do that, we're saying each agent has a type and that type can't change. But we could also model the idea that on each time step, there's some probability that the agent could change. So maybe it's a very small percent, but it would capture the exact thing that you're describing, which is that we see someone defecting every time, 100 times in a row, and then all of a sudden they just start acting much more cooperative. That kind of enrichment would be able to capture and say, oh, I need to actually throw out my old data because I'm dealing with essentially a new agent here, and we'd be able to learn that online very efficiently without really changing much, just by adding in basically a hidden Markov model on top of the state, the state where the states here would be the types. So I think that's a really interesting direction. We haven't done that, but it's something I've been really interested in and excited about.
Thank you.
Well, if nobody's got any more questions, I've got some. There's some interest, I'm blocking on his name now, Bethany Burnham and
Moshe Hoffman?
Hoffman have been writing about the difference between discrete strategies. Now, this is in a game theoretic setting, but and a couple of papers argued that continuously varying moral rules. Well, in the first paper, they claimed they couldn't evolve, but there's obviously a problem with that because they do evolve, they exist. And then in this recent paper about charity, it's basically based on the same idea. And Minhwa Yan and I have got an unpublished manuscript, which from a completely different perspective, not a game theory perspective, but I guess you'd call it a behavioral mechanistic perspective, in which the strategies have continuously variable they behave extremely differently. And in particular, you don't get any of the rare type disadvantage payoff structure that I think is part of your model, part of the secret handshake model. So once one type gets common, you've got to behave that way in order to get a good payoff, right? Because if you deviate, you get a poorer payoff, even if you're doing nice things. So I wondered if you have three types. They're discrete, right? They're different
Yes.
weightings on the sum of the other people's payoffs, 1.5 or something, and if those were continuously varying parameters, I mean, you could obviously do the Bayesian math. The question is, have you done that? What happens?
Yeah. Well, so just to be clear, it's not one, like the reciprocal agent is continuous in that it's kind of dynamically adjusting the fraction. But in the limit,
but there must be some norm in the pop. There must be some. It must converge on. I'm sorry.
It does converge. So yeah, exactly. It converges to 1 in the case of same and 0 in the case of not same. So, but yeah, like what if you? So we haven't run this stuff, but like, yeah, what if it was? What if you just build it in? What if when you converge, you do 1/2, right? Or a whole medley of those. I think that would make things challenging, right? Because those would have their own kind of, both have their consistent logic, but also in some ways be kind of Pareto dominated, right? Or they would have a weaker stable. What's the correct term here? It's like a less robust equilibrium, I think, because you'd have the ability to go to that full 1.0 and have a better group reward. So I'm not sure.
So just to tell you what in Minuit's model and mine, the problem we see is suppose that the best value is a half for some reason or other. Now that's not couldn't be true in your exact model, but if that's being maintained, so suppose that's best for the group, but actually suppose, I mean, you have a finite population, you get a little drift, and all of a sudden it's 0.49. Well, that's now the best, or there's some migration or something. So that's now the best value, and 0.5 isn't anymore, and 0.5's gone. And so it just, the rare type disadvantage payoff structure that is so important for norms and with discrete values just disappears completely. And what matters, and I think this is also true of Moshe's models, what matters is some external source of payoffs, so psychology or actual material payoffs or whatever it is. And then the social part of it kind of, and I find this quite disturbing because it can't be the truth, but it is interesting. Anyway.
Yeah, no, I wonder if there's something, and I think this is part of some of Moshe's models without getting too much into the weeds of like, if you just assume that there's a lot of noise in the world, whether these things either, you can kind of develop kind of a signal detection theory of where you end up recovering some kind of discreteness back out of it, right? Where you don't, by just assuming you don't have the ability to represent any of these differences. I'm not sure though.
We tried that, it didn't work, but
okay.
Okay. Any other questions?
I've got a quick question.
Go ahead.
Hey, Max, thanks for the talk. So I was thinking about your strategy, the reciprocator. And to me, it feels more, kind of like a Bayesian xenophobe, basically.
Yeah.
It just figures out who's different to itself and goes after them in a slightly unpleasant fashion. But intuitively, it feels that should almost be the perfect evolvable strategy, right? So that's part one, is my intuition right there? And then the second part of my question is, but seemingly in conflict with that, when you have very few interactions, the always defect wins. And is that just because the priors for the Bayesian strategy are wrong? Because I think your priors were that they start off thinking that it's a 50% chance someone's a reciprocator, 25-25, that they either always defect or always cooperate, which obviously when always defect is dominant, those priors are really misleading. You're going to start thinking loads of people are reciprocators when they're not, they're defectors. And so you will get pummeled as this Bayesian strategy. So if the priors were different, or if the priors were perfect, would the Bayesian strategy always win? And even if they're not perfect, if you let the priors evolve with the population, would the Bayesian strategy always win?
Okay, so first part, I would say, I think I share your intuition that there's like, and I think this relates to, I think it was Adam's point earlier about kin selection, which is like, there's some sense here, which it feels like this just, if it works, it's like exactly the right thing you should do, because it's just, you're finding yourself, right? The second part, so I share that intuition. I think that's also how I think about it. The second part is interesting. So, okay, so I think there's sort of two ways of thinking about it. I mean, if you think about it, just a one-shot interaction, right? In the limit here, any probability of cooperating is going to do worse than always defecting, right? So I think that's just like the fundamental wall of the environment you're against. There's nothing about agency or, it's just what is the actual value of the cooperative strategy. In that case, it would be, it would just be a strictly dominated Nash. It wouldn't be, there wouldn't be any cooperative Nash equilibria, right? So in the repeated game, you can have cooperative equilibria through some of these reciprocal strategies. In the one-shot, non-repeated version, you don't. So that's why I mean, there's a fundamental place where just we won't see cooperation. Now, you brought up a really interesting question, which is, you know, if I set, let's think about the limit of these priors, right? If I put the prior as 100%, I'm going to be facing some selfish guy. Well, I just return back into the selfish guy, right? I never learn, and I have no probability of weighting them. So, okay, what if we move a little bit away from that? We've experimented a little bit with this of like basically the same agent, but priors that are flipped. I instead of assuming that I'm likely to, that I'm going to be facing one of my own, I'm going to assume that I'm facing someone who's not me, or in particular, facing someone who's selfish. And you get a little bit of like it's sort of what Rob described earlier of like this handshake, in the same way that win, stay, lose, shift does that kind of handshake. It's like you both kind of defect, but then you're like, oh, you defected, and then, oh, now you cooperated well, and then you can kind of get, sometimes you can recover cooperation, but it's really inefficient. And so to get that to work in the right context, you would need to do again what you said of like having the priors evolve with the agents. And for the computational, we haven't been able to do that because of the computational complexity. I don't know what would happen. I think it'd be cool to look at. I would be scared for some of the reasons that Rob mentioned earlier about the continuousness, and you know, is 0.49 prior, and how does that interact with 0.5? And I think there could be something really interesting there to try to figure out, but it's really hard to vary too many things in these simulations. So we haven't done that, but that would be cool to look at for sure. Certainly priors are a good way to model like what kind of a group am I going to be starting in, right? And especially if you modeled like a multi-level selection where you're moving between groups, maybe you would learn a prior and then use that to generalize across groups. Like you can imagine almost, this would be cool, like an over hypothesis, right? So if I enter a group and it's either all cooperators or all defectors, then I only need one data point when I get to a new group to know whether it's all cooperators or all defectors. Versus if it's like each group is like 50%, well then I might as well, I have to do a lot of learning versus being able to do one-shot learning. So you can imagine like the value of an over hypothesis there in the Bayesian context to make learning even faster and more effective.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, Max. And we'll see everybody else back here in 2 weeks. Okay.
Great. Thank you all for the great discussion.
Max, great talk.
Feel free to shoot me an email if you want to discuss more. Take care.
Great. Bye.
Bye.